Hello, everyone. We are going to dive into the 360 report and show you what you actually get. These are actually my personal results. So, we're going to dive into actual results, starting with diet nutrition, first of the six systems. You see what pops up here is these micro reports within the system, starting with the system summary, which is an encapsulation of all the micro reports. But in diet nutrition, you see behavioral genetics. How do you even perceive food, hunger, satiety, carb metabolization, fat metabolization? Should you be on a keto diet or not? Is it the right thing for you? Microbiome health, and of course, micronutrients and how you deal with all of those. We're then going to look at sleep and how sleep is affected by your various genetic components, starting with circadian rhythms and that internal clock and how it's set and how you deal with time. Stress response, the head spinning, thinking about things and not being able to sleep. Environmental response, the chemicals preventing you from recovering. Food response, and of course, pleasure, scrolling on TikTok and Instagram till late at night, not being able to shut it off, and why some people have an issue there. Hormones, fitness, and body type. So we look at how the body is actually driven and developed by the hormones you produce. So fitness, what type of workout should you be doing? Rest and recovery. Why do some of us go to the gym every day and some can not handle more than a couple times a week? And more importantly, what do you do about it if you want to change? Then there's, of course, hair health and skin health and how your hormones drive those things. We then look at mood and behavior, which is probably the largest report of the six. And in here, we look at addiction, ADHD, anxiety, burnout, empathetic behavior versus logical behavior, irritability and frustration, procrastination, which, yes, is genetically driven, thinking patterns and neurotic tendencies, those people that sort of have the drama queen response, call it, give too much meaning to things. All the neurochemicals of your brain are driven by DNA, which then determines what your behavior and your personality is actually like. Inflammation or cellular health, the innate health of the cell, which drives inflammation and disease, driven by oxidation, glutathionization, methylation, and vitamin D. These are the big things that maintain and support the health of the cell. And if any of them are not being handled properly, you, of course, are more susceptible to inflammation, which then leads to disease. But we can tell you what to do about it. Cardiovascular health, it's the biggest sort of chronic condition, and so we've included it. We look at hypercholesterolemia, hypertension, inflammation, and statins, which is a drug that's it's the number one drug that's used for cardiovascular conditions. If I drill into one of the actual reports, we can show you what they look like. So this is what they all look like. You're going to see the actual genetic underpinnings that deal or cause the problem. Then you're going to see some recommendations, but you're also going to see it in language you can understand. So, pointing out where your red flags are, where the risks are, what genes are involved, so you understand the science behind what we're saying. And there's often multiple gene pathways that are combined. Then we look at recommendations, which is important because we have not only diet recommendations, but also lifestyle. What should you be doing? What habits do you need to form? What habits do you need to remove? And most importantly, what supplement should you take for that particular condition if it is a red flag for you? So we tried to be comprehensive about how you can take each one of these micro reports and literally build a plan around it. If we go into the GeneCast, we've now taken another layer and said, okay, we've given you reports. We're also going to give you an audio file, which acts as like a personal consult, as if you're sitting with a scientist who is examining and analyzing all this for you and telling you what it means. And if you can click on any one of these genes and understand at the scientific level what's happening. So let's click this as an example.
9p21. The 9p21 is not necessarily a gene per se, but is rather a chromosomal locus, in other words, a location on your chromosome, that has one of the strongest genetic associations to cardiovascular disease.
And where it's now talking about the personalized result.
To resist a certain level of toxins in the bloodstream, but it's possible that they can become overwhelmed depending on your lifestyle and dietary habits. You will want to keep a close eye on the rest of your cardiovascular profile, as the overall profile can mask an average or optimal result in any particular section.
So that's personalized to the individual. You're getting your own personal podcast, which is telling you about each area and each gene. And lastly, there's a video that tells you the story so that you can put this all into context and understand it better.
If we think of one word that points to how we think of cardiovascular health differently, it's inflammation. That one thing that is a root cause of cardiovascular issues is prompted by genetic suboptimalities. Your genetic disadvantages that prevent you from being able to cope with inflammation in the areas that would lead to cardiovascular disease.
So you can see in between the reports, the personalized podcast, and the video, we've come at it from all angles to help you get better and add 10 years to your life.
Are you struggling with chronic sleep problems? Do you find it difficult to fall asleep, stay asleep, or feel rested and energized after you wake up? Do regular supplements like melatonin simply not work to help you relax and fall asleep? Chronic poor sleep affects millions of people around the world. Most of us are overworked and overstressed, and we feel like we barely have enough time in the day to rest and relax. On top of that, digital technology has made us addicted to using our phones and other digital screens, especially at night. The dysfunction caused by these factors become more relevant when you don't have the best versions of important genes in your DNA, like 5-HTT-LPR, ADRA2B, BDNF, and the clock gene. These genes impact how we respond to physical and mental stressors like family, work, digital screens, and physically demanding tasks. While many people may just take supplements like melatonin to mask over the symptoms, it's important to get to the root cause and support optimal genetic expression so you can have sustainably good sleep. Sleep Optimizer is designed to support cognitive function and promote a sense of calmness to enhance sleep quality. This sleep support formula contains ingredients that address the root cause of poor sleep by supporting optimal genetic function. Ingredients like 5-hydroxytryptophan or 5-HTP are important in this regard. 5-HTP is an essential precursor to the production of serotonin and melatonin. Serotonin plays a role in improving mood and achieving a state of calm. Optimal serotonin function is necessary for achieving sustainable quality sleep. 5-HTP is especially effective for those with suboptimal 5-HTT-LPR function. L-theanine is an amino acid found in green tea. L-theanine can help cultivate a calm, clear, and creative mental state by promoting alpha brainwaves. These alpha waves occur during deep meditation, resulting in a relaxed state without the sedating effects. At the same time, L-theanine decreases beta brainwaves, which occur during excited and alert states. Ashwagandha, holy basil, and relora are adaptogenic herbs that work synergistically to support optimal management of outcomes related to genetic expression. The effects of these adaptogenic herbs reduce the impact of stress on our bodies so our bodies can manage and better process stress. Ashwagandha, holy basil, and relora have all been studied to relieve anxiety, insomnia, and stress-induced depression. If you're a person struggling with chronic poor sleep, stop wasting money on supplements that don't work and focus on using supplements that identify and treat the genetic root causes to support sustainable outcomes related to optimal sleep.
It's a little known fact that genetics highly impact your sleep. For various reasons, your stress response, how you cope with food, the circadian rhythm, your internal clock of your body, understanding when it's even time to sleep, all these things are regulated through your genetics. And it's only through making the right choices that you'll have proper sleep, and it's through making the wrong choices that you'll have issues that a lot of people have. Chronic sleep issues affect 30% of Americans now, which lead to diseases like cardiovascular, cancers, obesity. These are all rooted in not getting proper rest, which is a time when your body actually recovers. So let's explore together the genetics that drive the various factors that may help you or prevent you from sleeping properly. The human body works in circadian rhythms, and the most well-known of those is the wake and sleep cycle. We all hear that we need to sleep 7 to 8 hours to get that full restful night, but how does that actually look like and how is it broken up? The circadian rhythm of the sleep cycle is actually broken up into 2-3 hour chunks. Each one of those gets you into that deep REM sleep where you're dreaming and getting true restful recovery. It takes you about an hour and a half to get into that REM state where you're sleeping and dreaming, and you kind of wake up but you don't quite experience being awake, and you do it again. Happens twice, that's 3 hours. You then do wake up and experience that ruffling in bed, getting out to go to the washroom, and then going back, and you do it again for 3 hours. If you've accomplished that twice, you've got good quality sleep in terms of the right amount of time. How deep did you sleep is a different question. You may not be doing that. For example, some people just can't get to sleep. They lie there awake and it takes them hours and they miss that first chunk entirely. There's some people for which they fall asleep but they wake up and can't get back into the second set. There's a lot of external factors, and this is where genetics come to play. What are you doing that's preventing you from experiencing the proper circadian rhythm? Simple example, lying in bed at night on your phone with that blue light mimicking sunlight and interrupting your brain's ability to know it's time to deploy the sleep hormones and put my brain into a restful state. Many triggers like that you can learn about, that you should be implementing to make sure you're getting that deep restful sleep and not interrupting your circadian rhythm. Your relationship with food can drastically affect the quality of your sleep, and it's through understanding your genetics that you know what choices to make. For example, carb metabolization. There's some people for whom it's a very difficult process and it will actually knock them out and put them to sleep. That carb crash that you experience a couple hours after eating something that you were never meant to eat. For some people, they're highly efficient at turning carbs into glucose and using them as fuel, and eating it too late, it may wake them up. So you have to be able to understand, for the different things that you're doing in your diet, what is the net result for you, which starts with understanding genetically how you metabolize all these macro and micronutrients. It's important to time your meals properly. It's important to plate your meals properly and ensure that the macros and micros match your genetic needs. It's also important to understand coping mechanisms and how you may lean on food and how you may binge or be addicted to foods and how that affects the quality of your sleep. So as you dive into your personalized diet, you'll understand and implement things that will actually affect the quality of your sleep, which will help you recover, will help you avoid future healthcare problems. You often hear, I was so stressed out that I couldn't sleep. But why do you also hear, I was so stressed out I fell asleep? The same problem, two very different outcomes. Again, genetically predetermined. The way that we process stress and the way that we cope with it depends on the neurochemicals we have in our brain and to what degree do we bind them, to what degree are we regulated for them, and how do we experience them. So when you're under that stressful response, if you find it's not just a coincidence that I can't sleep or it puts me to sleep, that's true. That's the way you're wired. And so it's important when you're planning to sleep to understand how stress affects you and to use that as part of your mapping. So as you explore your stress response from a genetic level, you'll know why it happens and what to do about it. That allows you to implement the changes that allow you to sleep better, will give you more recovery, which will lead to better health. One thing we have to do to understand why we aren't getting proper sleep is to look at it in today's context. All that stimuli, the Netflix, the laptop, the phone. The reason why some of us can cope with these things properly and some of us can't is our pleasure response. Some of us are wired to be addicts. Some of us are wired to be bingers. What's the difference? There's some of us for when we fall asleep, you just can't put the phone down because you did not experience pleasure. Our dopamine binding capabilities are suboptimal, and so that pleasure response is hard to achieve, and so we keep seeking it, and we seek it, and we continue seeking it until we get that hit, and that's when we can eventually go to sleep with satisfaction. Some of us are the opposite, where you can't let that pleasure response go. You put that Netflix show on, and you binge, and you binge, and you binge until all of a sudden it's 3 a.m. and you realize you didn't go to sleep. On both ends of the scale, our lifestyle choices are preventing us from getting that deep, restful sleep by preventing us even getting to sleep on time in the first place. It's important to understand at a genetic level how your neurochemicals are wired to know if you are overdoing it, either as an addict or a binger, to be able to take a step back and make the changes that are required to put those bad habits away, get the proper restful sleep you need so you have a better health outcome. One of the less obvious reasons why people don't sleep properly is actually their environmental surroundings and how they affect them. And there's two ways that this happens: during the day and during your sleep. During the day, you may be exposed to things that you genetically just can't cope with. If you're missing the detox genes, if you're not methylating properly, if your mitochondria is under pressure, and generally your cellular health is not the best. You may not be able to get to sleep or stay asleep properly because there's so much load on your system from coping with that to begin with. So it's important to understand at a genetic level how you deal with toxins, how you deal with the environment around you, and what your current state may be. Secondly, we need to understand what's happening while you actually are sleeping. Are you being affected by the mattress that you're sleeping on for several hours that may have toxic fire retardants on it? Are there chemicals that were used to clean your room? Is there something in your air vents that is keeping you up at night? It's important to understand that as you sleep, If your body is constantly fighting a challenge that you're putting on it, it may take you out of that deep, restful sleep and keep you up over and over and over again. So as we dive into your genetics, an important layer to look at is how do you deal with cellular health, detoxification, and apply that in the context of sleep. This is where you can guarantee yourself to get deeper, better quality sleep, to reduce inflammation, improve recovery, and have better health outcomes. For the right person, a vegan diet can actually be an incredible thing. The social benefits, the personal health benefits of not being inflamed from red meats and fats, etc., it can be great if it is suited to your genotype. For the wrong person, it can be horrible. And why do we say that? There's one gene that helps you break down plant-based foods. The FUT2 gene will help you with things like beans, legumes, some of the bigger sources of protein for people that are on that plant-based diet. And what happens if you're not genetically designed to take that stuff in? It's very important to investigate this for yourself, because there's the short-term effects of I feel bloated and I can't eat, but there's a longitudinal effect of Crohn's disease, inflammation in the bowel and gut lining, even things like psoriasis, rooted in eating the wrong foods that your gut was never meant to deal with. But beyond that, there's other things to consider. Of course, there's a lack of B12 in the plant-based diet, and there's plenty ways to supplement that, but you have to make sure you're doing it the right way. Genetically, there's different versions of B12 that are absorbed different ways. At the gut or directly in the mouth as you're chewing into the capillaries under your tongue. You need to know genetically what you're designed to do to make sure you're supplementing properly. Beyond that, there's of course the carbs. Plant-based diets often are leaning heavily towards carbs, and for some people that is a recipe for type 2 diabetes. So it's very important to understand genetically how you process various macro and micronutrients, so that if you do intend on getting a plant-based diet, that you plate your food properly to avoid these potential health risks. One particular area where parents have asked us to decode it genetically is the science of ADHD. People that are distracted, can't focus, and are jumping from one thing to another. And there's certainly something to be said about that genetically. When you look at how neurochemicals are processed in the brain, the answer starts to become more clear. And it really leans on two things. It's about reward and pleasure, and then distraction and lack of focus. And if we start with the first, those of us that have the low version of the dopamine, that are constantly seeking reward, may appear to be jumping from one thing to another, because it's very easy to excite us and get us onto that next thing. Now imagine if on top of that, your COMT enzyme is fast, flushing the dopamine out extremely quickly, and that experience lasts for a very short time. You're going to do it more and more and more, quicker and quicker and quicker, jump from thing to thing to thing, and appear to not have attention. The other end of this is serotonin. For those of us that are dysregulated for serotonin, meaning that we get easily irritated. If you're in that room in that meeting, meaning to be working on something, but there's a clock ticking, or somebody chewing on something, or a noise outside, and it's drawing your attention away, preventing you from being able to focus. Outwardly, that looks like I don't have attention. I cannot focus on what I'm doing. But it's actually that details draw me towards them, and the last thing I was doing, I can no longer pay attention to. Now, the enzyme that clears the serotonin out, if you have the fast version of that, MAO, again, this is going to happen more frequently, and it'll be even more exaggerated. So in both cases, it's about the base level neurochemical. To what level do I experience that thing, that pleasure or reward, and how often am I going to seek more and more of it? On the other end, it's how often are things going to irritate me and details poke at me and prevent me from focusing on what I'm doing. And on both of them, how long does that thing last, meaning how quickly I'm going to jump to the next one. If you look at these two examples, combine them both, which is the case for many of us, that looks like ADHD. I can't stick to one thing, I need to jump from thing to thing, I can't focus, everything distracts me, I can never sit down and get anything done. If you were to understand it at the genetic level, you will be able to mitigate it if needed. Foods, supplements, lifestyle, environment, diet changes, there's things that can be done to balance these neurochemicals off if that change is desired. For those of us that have children that seem to be distracted and you're just starting to think about whether or not they need to be medicated, or even ourselves not being able to focus and wondering what is the answer, before going down that route, it may be best to look into your genetics and see if this is the way you're actually wired, and maybe there's a better way to go about the solution. There's a lot of work we do in terms of supporting charities and research organizations in terms of helping them understand the why behind the problem. There's people that get sick and get great treatment, great solutions, but why did it even get there? Why did the chronic disease set in? That's the thing that genetics can inform. And there's one particular case that always sticks out to me because of the emotion behind this woman's discovery. She had breast cancer twice, and she could not figure out the why. Her mission was, why does this even happen? She understands that there's the best doctors treating her. She understands that there's the best medicine in terms of what's available to her to deal with this issue. But why did it happen? What should she be changing in her environment, nutrition, or lifestyle to help prevent it from happening again? So we dove into her genetics. And what we found was peculiar, but also a very clear answer. Women, as they go through their monthly hormonal cycle, and men do the same thing on a daily basis, go from progesterone to testosterone to estrogen. Women, as they go through their monthly cycle, go from progesterone to testosterone to estrogen. But before clearing that estrogen at the end of that monthly cycle, it's converted into an estrogen byproduct, 2, 4, or 16 hydroxyestrogen. The first of which is a great clean metabolite, the second two are toxic. We see a lot of women with 4-hydroxy, which is somewhat concerning, but not often, and in very rare cases, we do sometimes see the 16, a very potent toxic byproduct of estrogen metabolization. This particular woman produced that. Now, not only that, she was also estrogen dominant, meaning the estrogen levels to begin with were already very high. So every month she was producing exorbitant amounts of estrogens, creating this net metabolite of a very toxic byproduct, and that's what she was flushing out in her monthly cycle. Now add the load on top of that. She was also taking the birth control pill. What is the birth control pill? But more estrogen. You already had this pathway that leads to extreme toxicity, and now you add more load and more fuel to the fire, you just end up with more net byproduct of toxicity. And at her age, once you get into the 40s and early 50s, if you're still having a menstrual cycle and haven't hit menopause yet, what happens to your estrogens? What happens more particularly to your toxic estrogens? They get stored in fatty tissue. Where do women have fatty tissue? In the hips and in the breasts. And the breasts, of course, are chock full of sensitive glands that just were never meant to handle that type of toxicity. Now, when you put it all together, you land on a root cause. Now, what is even more interesting about this is her son had testicular cancer twice. And we go back to look at his genetics, it was the exact same hormonal flow. And this is where we say that the taboo around hormones and what we believe about it being a female problem is not true. It depends on your net metabolization and what you're doing, and not to assume that because you're a woman, you're doing this with estrogen, and because you're a man, you're doing this with testosterone. You have to know what you're actually doing. And then, of course, her last question is, what could I have done about this? Well, if you had known what was leading to your health issues, you could have intervened. The thing that led to the health concern wasn't starting at cancer. It started at toxic estrogen. That's what needed to be focused on, but it could only be focused on if you only understood that in the first place. And to understand that, you have to know your genetic map. We have different perspectives on what we want from body type, what our goals are, and that's fair for everybody. What you want is what you should aim for. But how do you get there unless you understand genetically what your body is designed to be? This is hormonally driven. The estrogen and testosterone in your body, which are genetically predetermined, will define what you look like outwardly. And if you're striving and working really hard towards a specific goal, meanwhile you don't even know what you're wired to be, you may be counterintuitive in your work. This is where it's important to decode the hormones of your genetics and understand, am I testosterone dominant, whether I'm a man or a woman? There's a woman for whom it doesn't matter what you do. You can't get the shape, you can't get the curves. You're testosterone or androgen dominant. You can get the six-pack without even trying, but you can't get the hips. There's a woman for whom the hips and the curves are no problem, but try and get that defined striated muscle, it never happens. This is hormonally based, and it's true for men and women. There's men for whom it doesn't matter how hard you train. You can get big, you can get strong, but you can't get ripped. There's men that can get strong and they can get ripped, but they can't get big. These are challenges that we're facing as we reach for our goals, and we're using one-size-fits-all type applications to get there when that's not how the human body works. When you understand your genetics, you at least understand foundationally what your body is wired to do, what hormones are telling your systems, and how you are defined physically. From there, it's much easier to set your goals and know what to do next. The one area where the failure of one-size-fits-all applications has touched almost all of us is weight management. This is where what do I eat, how do I train, how do I burn fat, how do I add fat or muscle if I'm trying to do that. The one-size-fits-all answers don't work for most of us because most of us aren't wired the same way. We need unique solutions. It starts with the brain and how do I even perceive food, satiety, addiction, binging, leaning on food as a coping mechanism. That's all hardwired up here already. You then get to personalized diet and nutrition. How do I deal with fats? How do I deal with carbs? How do I deal with macro and micronutrients in general? But the important foundation to it all is based in your hormones. If you don't understand hormonally how you're designed, you don't understand how you deal with fat. For the women that are trying to deal with cellulite over and over and over again, dealing with the symptom as opposed to understanding hormonally why it's even happening, imagine the implication of constantly fighting that battle of only the first layer. This is true for weight management in general. When it comes to storing fat, not having enough muscle, knowing how to add more muscle, it is all hormonally driven. And to understand your hormones will first tell you how are you even wired and how do you do these things, but more importantly, for the change that you are seeking, how do you do it for yourself? Not the one size fits all, not the trial and error, but what works for you. One question that always comes up when we get into conversations is, tell me about the genetics of hair loss. There must be some correlation, and of course there is. But it's not the stories you hear about, it comes from the mom side, it comes from the dad side. Yes, it's a genetic inheritance, it's a legacy of your parents that is passed on to you, but it's rooted in one thing, DHT. It's a potent, manly man version of testosterone, which is the same thing responsible for giving you those ripped, striated muscles. The toxicity of DHT is what leads to that follicle death and eventual hair loss. The beauty of this is by testing and knowing prior to, you can test a 5-year-old child and understand that their hormonal pathway leads to hair loss, whether you're a man or a woman. But if you carry this forward into healthcare, there's another issue that sticks out as highly important, prostate enlargement. The same toxic DHT, that manly man testosterone that leads to that follicle death, also leads to prostate enlargement, which of course we all want to avoid. But the good news is, knowing this early, you can do something about it. So again, for man or woman, understanding hair loss comes down to understanding hormones. Am I rich in DHT? In which case, I'm no longer rich in hair. Am I rich in estrogens, where I may have that thick, flowing, beautiful hair, whether I'm a man or a woman? So understanding the hormone profile will allow you to understand what you need to do about hair loss and hair retention. In the patients that we dealt with internally in our clinic, the area where we see the biggest room for improvement in the delivery of healthcare is female hormone health. Stuff that is very black and white at the genetic level has been treated very gray. It's unfortunate that it's taken for granted that these problems are just meant to happen. It's quote unquote your hormones and you have to go through it. Things like menopause, fibromyalgia, fertility issues, they're not understood at the root cause level, and therefore they're only ever treated at the symptom level. What we've understood is a number of things. First of all, hormones are not the same for all women. Estrogen metabolization, testosterone metabolization, estrogen toxicity, these are factors that are not considered. Are you estrogen dominant, where you are wired genetically to behave and physically manifest more feminine? Or are you androgen or testosterone dominant, where it's hard to get that curvaceous figure and you have those firm, ripped muscles, but fertility, PCOS, and other issues may arrive because of the imbalance in what your hormones are supposed to look like. This is where we've dove deep genetically, mapped out the hormonal cascade, so we understand to a net result for you, what does that look like? Breast health, menopause, fertility, even puberty. All these things that women go through that are treated again as very gray can be made very black and white if you were just to look at them through a personalized genetic lens. Men are more likely than women to ignore their health and leave it for a later day, play superhero and try and get through. And one area where you really see this is in hormone health, which gets completely ignored. There's areas like libido, hair loss, prostate health, where you don't start to deal with them until it's too late. This is where, by understanding your hormone health early on, you can start to map out your future and understand what to do now. If you're concerned about prostate health, if you're concerned about longevity and maintaining those high level of testosterone, which is the single greatest marker for male longevity, you have to understand how you deal with hormones to begin with. What if you're estrogen dominant? What if that hormone replacement therapy that the doctor gives you to boost your levels all gets converted into estrogen, because that's what you do at a genetic level? You need to understand this before you start to get into solutions. This is why we believe that all men, just like women, need to pay attention to their hormones to understand the major male issues, the things that you want to know, hair loss and libido, and the things you don't want to know, prostate health, longevity. Decode the map, understand your hormones, and ensure you have vitality for life. To truly understand fitness, you have to understand your hormones. To get away from trial and error, one-size-fits-all solutions, you need to know what works for you. And that starts by understanding how your body is wired. How was it designed? What was it meant to look like? It is only then that you can start to understand your goals and how to get there. Beyond that, there's major healthcare implications that come out of your hormonal system. And if you don't understand what you're designed to do, and you then end up putting a load that causes the wrong things to happen, that leads to healthcare implications. So as we go through the hormonal system, you'll start to discover how you're wired, how you're mapped, and what proper decisions to make. If we think of one word that points to how we think of cardiovascular health differently, it's inflammation. That one thing that is a root cause of cardiovascular issues is prompted by genetic suboptimalities. Your genetic disadvantages that prevent you from being able to cope with inflammation in the areas that would lead to cardiovascular disease. When we think about cardiovascular health, most disease actually doesn't happen in the heart. It actually happens in the arteries around the heart. This is the area where you're prone to inflammation, where you genetically could have different versions of what we call the endothelial lining. If you think about the arteries, the tube through which blood flows, that inner lining that the blood actually touches and passes through, that's where you can have a stainless steel version or a paper thin version. Now, what does that mean for your health? If you have the suboptimal version where it's prone to inflammation, you have to be aware of what inflammation you could possibly be causing it. This could point to your nutrition, your environment, your lifestyle, various layers of load being added to that lining that can't cope with much to begin with. Now, what happens if you do add that layer? What happens if you're smoking? What happens if you're eating wrong? What happens if you're doing the things that we hear about, for which some people still live to be 90 with no issues, and some people in their mid-40s or early 50s start to have cardiovascular concerns? The difference is the version of the endothelial. Some of those people being more prone to inflammation in this area because they have the weaker or thin version of that endothelial lining are more prone to experience cardiovascular health issues in and around the arterial walls. Once we determine that somebody has the suboptimal version of that endothelial lining, we then determine what does that point to, what are the potential risks. And one of the big red flags is cholesterolemia, or cholesterol buildup in the arterial walls. Now, why would this happen? There's something in between that we have to look at, and that is free radical activity, or a reason for inflammation to happen in the first place. These cells were never designed like the gut and the lungs were to deal with external environmental or toxic insults. They were in fact only ever meant to deal with clean, pure blood. And for that reason, if you do have free radical activity or toxins free flowing in the blood, they could potentially cause damage or abrasions to the endothelial lining. What is the body's response to that damage? It will actually deploy cholesterol as a hormone to mitigate the inflammation being caused. This is what would lead to that eventual buildup and blockage that we call the disease, cholesterolemia, which is rooted in toxicity in the blood, causing inflammation to that lining, then leading to cholesterol being deployed to mitigate that inflammation, which we treat at face value to get rid of the cholesterol, as opposed to the root cause, which is the toxicity to begin with. The causes and concerns around hypertension and blood pressure are quite commonly known, revolving a lot around diet, external factors like stress and sleep. But how do these things become personalized to each one of us? So how do we know what decisions we need to make? There are insights genetically that can inform us better, and we can personalize how we look at hypertension and blood pressure. For example, the ACE gene will determine how your body manages salt, and the levels of salt will determine the constriction of your blood vessels. That could have a major impact on the organs of your bodies as blood flow is regulated by constriction. The NOS3 gene will actually determine how you personally deal with the dilation of the blood vessel, meaning to what degree do you have an external force on that blood flow. Now, both of these areas are highly implicit when it comes to hypertension and blood pressure, which is a root cause of many diseases in the kidneys and in the heart. Your genes can inform you how you deal with salts, how you deal with constriction, how you deal with dilation to truly understand at a personalized level what the risks are for blood pressure and hypertension issues. The key to the genetics of diet and nutrition is that one size does not fit all. This is where we've been missing out. Generalized programs, trying to get onto the next fad, trying to make things fit into you instead of finding what works for you and then making that fit. This is where genetics was always needed as a tool. How do I personalize all this noise that I'm hearing and pick and pull what my body actually needs? As we explore the genetics of diet and nutrition, you're going to learn what works for you. When you get into exploring diet and nutrition information, you usually hit the two big macros, fats and carbs. And there's this big controversy over where you should be focusing. I should be on a keto diet, eating fat. I should be on a low carb diet. That's true for some people, not true for others. In fact, genetically, we've been able to determine that some people are great fat metabolizers. They actually burn fat and use it as fuel, where others are not. And imagine the danger and the implication of somebody going on something like a keto diet when they don't actually use fat as fuel. They end up storing it. Now imagine the flip opposite. When you're looking at carbs, again, genetically predetermined, how do you actually take carbs and turn them into glucose and use them as fuel? If you don't understand how you do that process, you don't know what the right choice is for you. For the person that's making the wrong choice, it's the difference between burning fat and storing fat. So if your goal is to pick the right diet, you have to understand genetically how you're wired and how you're actually using macronutrients and converting them into fuel. When we look at the genetics of diet planning, the first thing we look at is actual perception. How do you even perceive food? How do you perceive satiety, that I feel satisfied in my stomach? How do you feel satiation, that I feel satisfied in my mouth? This is genetically predetermined. There's genes that actually determine how quickly you feel full and how satisfied you feel in your mouth. What could this lead to? Overeating. I don't have that trigger between the stomach and the brain telling me it's time to stop, or the slower version of it, which means I may overeat. I may not feel the satisfaction from the food I ate and feel the need to snack or eat in between meals. That's a whole other genetic process. So we start here and say, before we even explore foods, what is your relationship with food? How do you feel full? How do you feel satisfied? When do you know it's time to stop? And when do you know in between meals that it's not time to snack, that you've had enough? Both satiety and satiation are genetically predetermined. As you explore your reports, you'll find where you sit and help you navigate your diet plan. There's a lot being said out there about gluten and lactose insensitivity. Both of these things are important to understand, especially if you're at the borderline. There's plenty of us that know we have an issue. We eat gluten, we eat lactose, there's a visceral response, it's a problem. There's some of us that aren't quite sure. There's that bloating, we're on the borderline. Is it gluten, is it lactose, or is it something else? That's the person for whom it's the most dangerous, because you may continue eating something that is very harmful to you. If you're in a position where it's genetically predetermined that you're not meant to have lactose and gluten in your diet, the inflammation and damage being caused and the long-term effect of that is something you definitely want to avoid. This is why it's important to explore the genetics of both gluten and lactose insensitivity to understand where you lie. And you should know that if these are things that genetically your body was never meant to take in, that you should stop immediately to prevent damage being caused. How is it that we know when we test a young child that that child is going to need glasses when they get older? How is it that we know when we meet an adult that they don't get sick that often? Because we understand the genetics of micronutrients, vitamin metabolization. When we look at things like beta-carotene metabolization, it's very easy to predict how somebody's eye health may evolve over time. The same thing is true of vitamin C and general immunity from the average cold and flu. But what's really important is to look at vitamin D. And this is where genetically there's insights that go far beyond the simple blood testing. Vitamin D is probably the most important micronutrient you can take in. Of the 22,000 genes that are actively working in your body, instructing various biochemistry, 10% of that load requires vitamin D in order to function. That's over 2,000 genes at any given time need vitamin D in order to keep your body at an optimal level. Now, vitamin D has two phases. There's one thing to draw it out of the sun or out of food and put it into your blood. That's where we're able to measure and say, with a simple blood test, you have the right amount of vitamin D or not. But are you utilizing that vitamin D? There's an entirely separate genetic function to take the vitamin D from the blood and put it into the cell where it's used. If you're suboptimal there, you could very easily be having issues like anxiety, seasonal mood disorder, low immunity, low ability to recover from a flu, a whole multitude of issues that could come out of this one micronutrient that is responsible for so much. This is why it's so important that you understand how you deal with micronutrients at a genetic level so that you can properly plan your meals and your supplementation. When we look at the prevention of chronic disease, the one area that really pops out is type 2 diabetes. In fact, the Center for Disease Control has recently launched a program where practitioners can actually work on what's called pre-diabetes, meaning the early risks and warning signs for people that may eventually become type 2 diabetic. But the one piece missing from that equation is the personalization, understanding the genetics of insulin resistance. This is different for all of us, and that one hormone that is so implicit in type 2 diabetes can be dysregulated for some and optimal for others. For those of us for whom it is dysregulated, we need to be extra careful in our meal planning and understanding what actually is the right and wrong choice for each of us. If there's been type 2 diabetes in your family, if it's been close to you, it's even more important to explore the genetics of insulin resistance and understand how you are meant to eat. Early days at the DNA company, one of our early stage investors had come to see us at the office and was concerned that at the age of 38, he had already developed cholesterol issues. And if you were to look at his diet and lifestyle habits, it just didn't add up. He was exercising 6 days a week. He ate properly. As a pharmacist, he was very careful about his health in general, as well educated on the subject. Why then did he have this issue? He asked, is this genetic, quote unquote? And that's where we said, well, we're not going to look for direct causation, but we're going to understand your systems and try and figure out what got you there. When we looked at his genetic map, the first red flag we saw was the endothelial lining, that inner lining of the arteries around the heart. He had the suboptimal version, so call it the paper-thin version. On top of that, his detox pathways were suboptimal. In fact, he was actually missing 2 of the main detoxification genes. Lastly, his methylation or anti-inflammatory capacity was not there. So now you have to look at lifestyle. What was he doing that would cause him to express this cholesterol issue? Because you could have that exact same genotype, put someone on a beach in Aruba, and they'll never get sick because there was no load put on them to get them there. As an avid golfer, directly after work, he would go straight to the golf course and spend a few hours there. And what was he exposed to that he wasn't able to handle? The toxic chemicals, the pesticides that made that golf course so beautiful to begin with. Something that seems so innocent is actually extremely harmful if you aren't genetically designed to deal with it. The other 2 or 3 days a week that he wasn't golfing, he was playing tennis, which again would seem like a great thing for his health concern. Meanwhile, he was playing aggressively, and that was his cardio time. So in that cardio time, he was pushing himself till he was sweating and breathing heavy, meaning he was dipping into what's called oxidative stress. Burning that fuel in your mitochondria of your cell, that battery, the ATP, because the glucose free flowing in your blood is just not enough at that point. That produces smoke. You burn any fuel, gas, electricity, there's always a byproduct of smoke. So now he's got chemicals from pesticides free flowing through his blood. All these oxidants that he's produced from putting himself into oxidative stress from that heavy cardio, causing damage and abrasions to this thin cellular wall that was never meant to deal with toxicity in the first place. Typically, your anti-inflammatory system would kick in to reduce that inflammation and prevent disease, which he didn't do well. So what is the body's final response? Deploy cholesterol to that area as a hormone to mitigate the damage being caused and reduce the inflammation. What happens to cholesterol when it meets toxicity? It actually hardens and it stays there. At the age of 38, All of these great habits that he thought he had were actually what led to his cholesterol issue. A few months of intervention and we reversed things for him, we got him better, but this is why personalization is so important. The thing that is good for one person may be poison for another, but until you understand your genetic map, you don't know what choices to make. We pair immunity with detox because we know there's a functional layer that the conversation has been missing. When we think about immunity, we know that there's white blood cells out there fighting and trying to keep us healthy, fighting off viruses, working on various bacteria that may be affecting us. And we see that as the soldiers. That's who's out there fighting the fight. Where detox is implicit in this is the battleground. When you have cells that are under a load, that are already under stress, and then add on top of that the layer of the virus or that viral insult, the outcome is very different for that person who is healthy at the cellular level or unhealthy at the cellular level in terms of to what degree are they going to get sick. This is what we look at as we explore immunity and detox. So what is detoxification? We hear this word thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean and how does it work? There's a process called glutathionization, where glutathione is actually deployed in the body to bind onto toxin and take them to the liver, where the toxins are then metabolized and cleared from your system. At a genetic level, it's possible to not even have the genetic instruction for this process. When we look at the GSTT1 and the GSTM1, it's possible to not get a copy for mom or dad in your genetic code. What does that mean? That process of glutathionization, you're not actually doing properly. You could be doing it at 20 or 30% capacity versus a normal person. Now, if you're in an environment or if you're eating the foods or you're exposed to the things that are putting toxicants into your body, what would that net result then be? Inflammation, load on the cells then under stress, toxic insults causing damage. This would give you that suboptimal battlefield where cells are constantly under stress, trying to survive, and an additional insult like a viral infection would just hit you so much harder. It's important to understand your glutathione pathway so that you know what your risks are when it comes to inflammation and cellular health. One of the most important cellular processes in your body, which is also commonly misunderstood, is methylation. This is when methyl groups are sent to toxins to bind to them, make them water soluble, and help you remove them. This is really important when it comes to inflammation. Now that we know that toxins are in the system, now that we know they're causing problems, how do we deal with the inflammation being caused? That is methylation. Where this has been misunderstood is understanding how do I rank. We know the MTHFR gene is highly studied and highly talked about in medical circles in terms of understanding methylation, but it doesn't end there. There's a whole system. And having one poor gene or one strong gene doesn't mean you're doing a good job or a bad job. You have to be able to interpret the entire pathway to get to your net result. This is where our interpretation has moved away from a singular gene by gene interpretation towards a system-based interpretation, where we have to look from beginning to end, the entire methylation process, to be able to tell you where you rank and how well you're doing with this process, and therefore how you need to intervene with lifestyle, diet, and environment change. This is where interpretation needs to move beyond gene by gene siloed thinking to understanding the system or the map, a functional approach. We have done this by understanding the biochemistry of methylation and mapping the genes to mirror that biochemistry. And it's through that understanding that we know your net result, how you deal with inflammation, and what you should be doing with your environment, nutrition, and lifestyle to mitigate any problems. We think of toxicity and toxins as something coming in from the outside, but we also create them internally. Our cells actually produce oxidants and free radicals, which then enter our bloodstream and cause the same inflammation and harm that the external toxins would cause. How does this happen? The cell's job is to create energy and stay alive. They take in nutrition from food, they take in oxygen from your breath, and the cell then converts that to energy. In that process, you produce an oxidant. So that same oxygen that is keeping you alive is slowly killing you. The oxidants and free radicals in your system produced by this cause inflammation. Now, why is it for some people this is a problem and some people it isn't? Our genetic makeup and how we actually clear these oxidants at the cellular level is different for all of us. Now, if you take the person that has the best clearance and the person that has the worst, they could be doing the exact same thing with very different levels of stress on their cells. Where could some of that stress come from? Something as simple as cardiovascular exercise that you think is good for you and is probably good for your heart, but may be leading to additional oxidation from this process of taking in more oxygen, converting it into fuel, which then leads to more oxidants. The person that can't clear them is just going to have a lot more of it in their bloodstream, causing inflammation and wreaking havoc. This is why it's important to understand how you deal with mitochondrial clearance at the genetic level so that you know what lifestyle, environmental, nutrition choices to make. When we think about cellular damage, cellular inflammation, that load on our cells, as we've been talking about, there's a major outcome that we all want to avoid, and that is aging. In terms of the here and now, yes, immunity, yes, detox. Let's help ourselves be healthier. The longitudinal problem, this is what causes aging. Aging is literally damage to the DNA. It is that cellular stress. It is that sagging skin. It is that white hair. And if we only focus on what's happening on the outside, all we can do is to continue masking the white hairs and the sagging skin and the wrinkles. But if we move towards looking at the inside and understand why aging even happens, we can move towards dealing with the root cause. Cellular health, mitochondrial support, external toxins, all the things that lead to inflammation, that lead to cellular damage, that lead to DNA damage, which all equal aging. And again, it's different for all of us, our ability to cope. And by understanding your genetics, you will understand your personal risk for this load and what you need to do to prevent the aging issues that you're masking now from the outside. It's one thing to deal with our own health concerns and try and optimize, but it's a whole other layer when we're trying to help our children. Different level of pain, different level of concern. There's one case that we dealt with quite recently where there was a family that was concerned that over the period of about 2 years, their child completely changed. They said that they started developing migraines, they had brain fog, they weren't motivated, they had joint pains, and at the clinical level, there was a belief that there may be some form of autoimmune disease. So the question to us was, what can we do about autoimmune disease? And we said, before we go there, we have an inkling that there may be more going on here than just a clinical diagnosis of autoimmune disease. And so we dove deep into the genetics, and what we found was exactly what we suspected, that genetically the detox capacity was very low in this child, but on top of that, the methylation or the response, the protective anti-inflammatory response, was also not there. So we asked the simple question: think about your home, think about what this child is surrounded by. What did you change 2 years ago? Was there mold, perhaps a leak in the basement, perhaps some adoption of chemicals through pesticides or pest control? And they said none of the above. But the father then said, wait a second, 2 years ago was when we changed the mattress. And we said, aha, this is it. Mattresses are coated in a fire retardant that are highly toxic in nature. Now imagine, your child is lying on this thing and breathing in the off-gassing for 7, 8, 9 hours at a time. This is the day their child changed. The day that they got them to sleep on a toxic material for 8 hours at a time every given day. And it didn't take long before that child started to have migraines, brain fog, joint pain, general malaise in the brain, and inability to cope with much that was thrown at them. Genetically, we had determined what their child was capable of. Let's get rid of that thing that they weren't capable of coping with, the chemicals in their mattress. And so we got them to swap their mattress out for an organic mattress. Organic meaning that it was made of natural materials with no chemicals added. And within weeks, all the symptoms were gone. Now imagine the challenge of having to clinically deal with this and not knowing the root cause and only ever masking the symptoms. That is autoimmune disease, which would have gone on for year after year after year. Instead, this child is happy and healthy and also has their instruction manual decoded for future use to understand where they are weak and where they need to work harder. We were approached by a big city lawyer with a big problem. She could not lose weight. And the interesting thing is, she seemed to be doing everything right. She was eating right, she was exercising right, Even when we looked at her genetics hormonally, she didn't look like she had the profile that would lead to weight gain or have the type of physiology that was of concern to her. And this is where we had to dive a bit deeper and work with her to say what was she actually doing day to day that was causing this. Genetically, there may be something driving that, but let's understand what she was actually doing. So we started to document her lifestyle. We asked her, whenever you eat, make a note of it. Let's see what you're actually eating, when you're eating it. Let's start to look at things like circadian rhythm and hormones and the various layers that may lead to weight issues. And where we landed was not what we expected. Where we thought we're looking at the body, it was actually a problem of the mind. Genetically, she is serotonin dysregulated. What does that mean? That mood regulating neurochemical that's supposed to keep you in the middle. Not overreacting, not underreacting, not irritated, not overly excited. She did not do that well. So she was up and down like this. Now, keep in mind, as we looked at what we were documenting in her diet, it seemed like at work on a daily basis is when she was eating wrong, which she didn't realize she was doing. So why was this happening? It was at work when she was, as a high-power lawyer, under stress, irritated, in meetings that were bothering her, having to respond to letters that were problematic. This is when she would lean on food as a coping mechanism. Always in the snack room, always in the lunchroom, in fact, having her meetings there without even realizing that's what she was doing. And so when we narrowed down her behavioral problem to, I eat too much at work and I eat the wrong things at work, it had to do with serotonin dysregulation and the irritability for which her body would then lean on food to bring her back into a happy mood. This was easily solved. Now that we knew what the problem was, we were able to supplement her with the right ingredients that would actually regulate her serotonin and bring her back to that middle where she wanted to be. From there, weight melted off because we got rid of the behavior that was the source of the problem. Often people reach out to us to help with family members where they can't find an answer. There's a famous author from New York who contacted us saying that his sister-in-law was having serious issues when it came to her mental health. Any family gathering was always a disaster. She had issues at home with her son, she couldn't maintain a relationship, but having said all that, she certainly had some trauma early on in life that she was dealing with, and what we were trying to understand was, is it about the trauma or is there something more? So we looked at her genetics. What we saw was that her ability to cope with negative stimuli was highly suboptimal, meaning that in the case that she had experienced something traumatic, she would literally imprint it and remember it and hold on to and retain it. Now, on top of that, her serotonin was also highly dysregulated, meaning that everything irritated her. Everything that anyone tried to help her with was always considered annoying, and it was very hard to get to the solution because everything seemed to be a problem. Lastly, on top of that, brain-derived neurotropic factor, that thing that repairs the brain, the neuroplasticity, she was highly suboptimal there. She would give things far too much meaning because her BNF was dysregulated, so that weight of the trauma was even heavier. Now, when we got here, the family broke down in tears because she was described to a T. Constant pain, being held and carried with her to an extreme degree for which the meaning was much too high, and it prevented her from literally living a life. Now, the first thing we were able to do was understand the context and why this was happening, and there was a breath of relief because we understood it's not just about trauma causing damage, it's that the perception was skewed and they gave these instances far too much meaning and they carried too much weight, so it was very hard to move forward in normal circumstances. That moment of self-actualization is the first thing that allowed them to break through the pain and realize it didn't mean what they thought it meant. We then began working on therapeutics, mainly their food, because we've understood what ingredients, what food sources up and down regulate genetic expression, which for this person was so important. It made family life better, it made the child relationship better, it made life in general better. But here's the interesting thing. Where all of these problems were happening at the personal level, at work, this person was an extreme high performer. Why? Because they could see the details anybody else didn't see, because they gave things far too much meaning, and because they carried the pain back with them and did not make the same mistakes twice. Where they were ultra high performer at work, they were completely dysfunctional at home. But now we were able to give them that superpower that they had at work also at home, and to utilize what some people may consider deficiency to actually be their strength. So instead of being the person that needed help at home, she now became the person that was giving help as the emotional leader in the family.